Picture this. You are a hominin living approximately 500,000 years ago, somewhere in what will eventually become Germany, though nobody has named it that, and the concept of Germany is so far in the future it might as well be science fiction. You are not quite Homo sapiens. You are Homo heidelbergensis, a species with a brain approaching modern human size, a robust body built for the demanding physical life of the Pleistocene, and a daily existence that revolves around staying alive, finding food, and not becoming food. You have a problem. The problem is a horse. More specifically, the problem is that you need the horse, its meat, its fat, its hide, its bones. But the horse weighs approximately 500 kilograms, can accelerate to 50 kilometers per hour from standing, has hooves that can kill you with a single strike, and is currently on the other side of a meadow that offers no concealment between you and it. You have a hand axe, you have your hands, you have your intelligence, which is considerable, and you have a straight, heavy branch of spruce wood that you've been carrying for reasons that seemed pragmatic at the time, and are now feeling urgently relevant. The question is, what do you do with the branch? The answer to that question, worked out not in a single moment of inspiration, but across an enormous span of time, in the minds of multiple early human species, through a process of incremental refinement that spans hundreds of thousands of years, is the spear. And the story of how ancient humans actually invented it is simultaneously more ancient, more distributed, more accidental, and more cognitively impressive than most people realize. The spear is the most important weapon in the history of the human lineage, and possibly the most important tool of any kind before the agricultural revolution. That claim is worth unpacking before proceeding because it requires some context to properly appreciate. The development of effective projectile and thrusting weapons that extended the killing range of early humans fundamentally changed the risk-to-reward calculation of hunting large prey. Without any distance weapon, taking down a large animal required physical contact, grappling, bludgeoning, strangling. With something that was significantly stronger, faster, and more dangerous than the attacker. The mortality rate for ancient humans attempting to kill large prey through physical contact was, almost certainly, high enough to represent a selective pressure. The scars, healed fractures, and trauma visible in the skeletal remains of early human species are consistent with an extremely physically dangerous lifestyle that included close contact confrontations with large animals. A spear changes this calculation. A thrusting spear allows a human to engage prey from a distance of 2 to 3 meters, far enough to land potentially lethal strikes while remaining outside the most dangerous range of most prey animals' defensive responses. A thrown spear extends that range to 15, 20, 30 meters depending on the thrower's skill and the spear's design, allowing prey to be engaged before it has even identified the source of the threat. The transition from bare hands and rocks to pointed stick at range is not just a technological upgrade. It is a paradigm shift in what was possible for a moderately sized primate with no natural weapons to compete with the megafauna of the Pleistocene. Understanding how that transition happened requires going back further than most people expect. The beginning of the spear's developmental history is not with Homo sapiens, and is not even with the species that made the oldest confirmed spears in the archaeological record. It almost certainly begins with something as cognitively modest as picking up a stick. The use of branches and sticks as extensions of reach and as impact weapons is documented in living non-human primates. Chimpanzees use sticks to probe termite mounds, to investigate potential threats at a distance, and occasionally to brandish as threat displays. Orangutans use sticks to probe for insects. The behavior of using a stick as an extension of the arm, to reach something beyond the hand's reach, or to deliver force at a distance, is available to any primate with the manual dexterity to grip a stick and the cognitive capacity to understand the stick as an extension of themselves rather than simply an object. This basic stick-as-extension behavior is the cognitive and behavioral root from which the spear eventually grew. The cognitive leap required, that a stick can deliver force at the end of the stick rather than at the hand holding it, is not dramatic by any standard. It is probably available to many primate species. What made it the beginning of a technological trajectory rather than a behavioral dead end was the accumulation of additional refinements, making the stick longer, making it straighter, sharpening one end to concentrate force at a point rather than distributing it across a surface. The sharpening of a wooden point is where the spear story begins to require something more specific. The understanding that material removal from the end of a stick produces a shape that penetrates differently than an unmodified end, and that this penetration has hunting utility. This understanding requires either prior observation of how pointed objects penetrate compared to blunt ones, or direct experimentation, or both. It is within the cognitive capacity of late archaic hominins and is considerably within the capacity of early Homo species with brain sizes approaching modern human range. The oldest confirmed wooden spears in the archaeological record come from Schöningen in Germany, dated to approximately 300,000 years ago, discovered in the 1990s during lignite mining operations that exposed a Pleistocene lake bed where extraordinary organic preservation conditions had kept the wooden implements intact through 300,000 years of geological time. The Schöningen spears are not primitive. This is the detail that consistently surprises people encountering the archaeological evidence for the first time. 8 spears were recovered, ranging from 1.8 to 2.5 meters in length, carved from spruce trunks. Each spear is tapered at both ends, with the heaviest section positioned approximately 1/3 of the length from the front tip. Precisely the weight distribution that produces optimal throwing dynamics, placing the center of mass in the position that modern sports science identifies as ideal for javelin-style throwing implements. The makers of the Schöningen spears understood, through empirical observation and refinement rather than explicit aerodynamic theory, how to weight a throwing spear for flight stability and range. They selected the straightest grained sections of spruce available, worked the surface to reduce irregularities that would cause wobble in flight, and sharpened the leading end to a functional point. The finishing quality of these implements suggests not hasty improvisation, but practiced craftsmanship, the product of a tradition in which spear-making knowledge was refined and transmitted across generations. Associated animal remains at the Schöningen site include horse bones with butchery marks, suggesting that these spears were used in exactly the context that the opening scenario described: hunting horses in open landscape environments where distance weapons were necessary. The species that made these spears was almost certainly Homo heidelbergensis, the same species from the opening scenario, with a brain size ranging from 1,100 to 1,400 cubic centimeters, overlapping significantly with the modern human range. But the Schöningen spears, extraordinary as they are, almost certainly do not represent the origin of the spear. They represent a mature stage of development, implements refined to a level of sophistication that implies a long prior tradition of simpler spear use that has left no direct archaeological evidence because wooden implements in most depositional environments decompose completely over archaeological timescales. The evidence for earlier spear use is indirect but compelling. Cut marks on animal bones from sites dating back 500,000 years or more are consistent with systematic meat processing from large prey animals in ways that would have been extremely risky without distance weapons. The pattern of injuries visible in the skeletal remains of Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals. Healed fractures concentrated in the shoulder, arm, and torso regions in patterns similar to modern rodeo professionals who engage in close contact work with large animals suggests regular close-range engagement with large prey, but the presence of spearing injuries rather than purely trampling and goring injuries implies distance weaponry. Bone points and stone points that predate. Confirmed hafting evidence by hundreds of thousands of years suggests that the concept of a pointed implement for penetrating prey was established very early in the hominin tool-making tradition, even if those early points were handheld rather than mounted on shafts. The cognitive step from a handheld bone point to a mounted spear tip is meaningful, but not enormous. It requires the understanding that the point becomes more effective when the shaft provides reach, leverage, and force amplification, an understanding that observation and experimentation make accessible. The invention of hafting, Attaching a stone or bone point to a wooden shaft to create a composite tool is perhaps the most cognitively demanding step in the entire spear development story. And it is worth examining in detail because it illustrates the type of intelligence required for this class of technological innovation. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. A simple sharpened wooden spear is a single material implement. It is cognitively accessible. Observe that a pointed stick penetrates better than a blunt one. Make the stick more pointed, use it. Hafting is fundamentally different. It requires the concept of combining two distinct components into a single functional tool that is more effective than either component alone, and it requires the technical knowledge and manual skill to make the combination stable enough to withstand the forces of impact without separating. The cognitive demands include the capacity to plan the tool in advance rather than simply modifying existing objects, the understanding that the final tool's properties emerge from the combination rather than being present in either component, the ability to understand and execute the multi-step process of preparing both components and joining them, often involving adhesive preparation, binding material preparation, and precise shaping to produce a good fit between shaft and point. The earliest confirmed hafted implements date to approximately 500,000 years ago, with clearer evidence accumulating from approximately 300,000 years ago, and hafting becoming consistently documented in the archaeological record from approximately 200,000 years ago. The adhesives used in ancient hafting, pine resin, birch tar, ochre mixed with plant resins, animal fat mixed with mineral materials, were themselves products of multi-step preparation processes that required controlled heating, material combinations, and knowledge of adhesive properties that is specific, transmissible as cultural knowledge, and not obviously available from direct observation of natural materials in unprocessed form. Birch tar, in particular, is one of the most discussed early adhesive materials because its production requires temperatures above 340 degrees Celsius maintained with limited oxygen, producing conditions that cannot be achieved accidentally and require deliberate process management. The presence of birch tar on Neanderthal hafted implements provides some of the most direct evidence for Neanderthal capacity for complex multi-step tool production processes, and, by extension, for the cognitive sophistication of the species that was producing hafted spears across Europe and Western Asia during the period before modern human dispersal. The stone points that were hafted onto spear shafts have their own developmental story that parallels and intersects with the shaft development, and examining how ancient humans learned to produce effective stone spear points illuminates another dimension of the invention process. Flint knapping, the production of sharp-edged stone tools through controlled fracture, is a skill with its own long developmental history in the hominin lineage. The Oldowan stone tool tradition, dating to approximately 3.3 million years ago, produced simple flakes and cores through direct percussion. The Acheulean tradition, emerging approximately 1.7 million years ago, produced bifacially worked hand axes that required sustained attention, multiple reduction steps, and the ability to visualize the final shape within the raw stone. Spear point production, however, demanded something that earlier stone tool traditions didn't require: shape optimization for a flight and penetration function rather than simply for sharp edge production. An effective thrown spear point needs to be symmetrical for flight stability, thin enough to be light without being fragile, and shaped to penetrate tissue effectively upon impact. Producing a point with all these properties simultaneously required a level of spatial planning and technical precision that represents an advance over hand axe production. The Levallois technique, developed by Neanderthals and associated archaic humans approximately 300,000 years ago, was adapted to produce consistent, predetermined flake shapes through careful preparation of the stone core before the final flake was struck. The Levallois method essentially pre-programmed the stone's fracture trajectory through preparatory shaping, allowing the napper to produce flakes of shape and size with a single final blow. It is one of the most sophisticated stone reduction strategies in the Paleolithic record and was suited to the production of oval or leaf-shaped points that could be hafted as spear tips. The spear thrower, or atlatl, represents the next major technological amplification of the basic spear concept, and its development pushed ancient human hunting capability into remarkable territory. The atlatl is a shaft extender, typically 40 to 60 centimeters long, with a hook or socket at one end that engages the butt of a spear. When a thrower uses an atlatl, the throwing motion moves the end of the atlatl through a greater arc than the hand alone could manage, and the atlatl acts as a lever arm that amplifies the velocity imparted to the spear. The result is a dramatic increase in both range and impact force. Atlatl thrown spears reach velocities of approximately 100 to 150 kilometers per hour, compared to approximately 70 to 100 kilometers per hour for hand-thrown spears, and can carry lethal force to distances of 40 to 100 meters depending on the spear design and the thrower's skill. The atlatl also allows the use of lighter, more flexible spears, sometimes called darts, that would be inadequately stable if thrown by hand but fly with excellent stability when launched at higher velocity. The engineering relationship between atlatl and dart is a system optimization. The two components are tuned to each other, with dart spine flexibility calibrated to the atlatl's flex during the throw in a way that converts energy efficiently from thrower to projectile. The oldest confirmed atlatl artifacts date to approximately 17,000 to 21,000 years ago in the European Upper Paleolithic, where bone and antler atlatl hooks have been recovered in association with the Solutrean and Magdalenian traditions. But the technology may be older. The relatively small, light spear points associated with some late Paleolithic traditions are suggestive of atlatl use because they would be inadequate tips for hand-thrown hunting spears but appropriate for faster, lighter atlatl-propelled darts. The atlatl was apparently independently invented multiple times. It was in use across North America, South America, Australia, and parts of Africa and Europe at the time of first European contact, suggesting either multiple independent inventions or an extremely ancient common origin that predates the dispersal of modern humans to these regions. The concept, extend the lever arm of the throw to amplify velocity, is cognitively accessible to anyone who understands that a longer throwing arm produces greater speed at the tip, which is an observation available from the experience of throwing objects with different arm positions. The social and cultural transmission of spearmaking knowledge is a dimension of the invention story that the physical artifacts alone cannot fully illuminate. But that is essential for understanding how the technology was actually invented and developed. No individual ancient human invented the spear in a single act of inspiration. The spear was invented cumulatively, across many individuals, many generations, and in some cases multiple hominin species, through a process of incremental improvement in which each generation inherited the accumulated knowledge of previous generations and added its own small refinements. This cumulative cultural evolution, the ratchet-like process by which cultural knowledge builds across generations without losing the gains of previous generations, is one of the most distinctively human capacities in the animal kingdom. Chimpanzees show tool use and even some cultural transmission of tool use techniques, but the cumulative refinement over generations that produces qualitative improvements in tool sophistication is observed in chimpanzees at much more limited scales and speeds than in human populations. The transmission of spearmaking knowledge across generations required specific social and communicative capacities, the ability to teach intentionally, to demonstrate rather than simply use, to correct errors in learner performance through feedback, and eventually to describe processes verbally in ways that accelerate learning beyond what imitation alone achieves. The archaeological evidence for the sustained, Refined spear traditions visible in the record implies transmission systems sophisticated enough to maintain technical knowledge across many generations with sufficient fidelity to allow progressive improvement rather than oscillation around an unchanging mean. Apprenticeship, extended periods in which novice spear makers worked under the guidance of experienced craftspeople, was almost certainly the primary transmission mechanism in early human communities, just as it was in later human craft traditions for which historical documentation exists. The physical process of learning to knap flint to produce consistent point shapes involves spatial reasoning, fine motor control, and force calibration that are difficult to acquire quickly and that produce consistent outcomes only after extensive practice. The skeletal evidence for repetitive use patterns in ancient knappers' hands shows the physical imprint of thousands of hours of practice, suggesting that spearpoint production was a skilled specialty acquired through sustained developmental effort. The shift from thrusting spear to thrown spear to atlatl launched dart represents a progressive extension of the fundamental principle. Place a lethal point on something that delivers force at a distance that culminates not in the atlatl, but in the bow and arrow, which carries the same principle to its logical maximum of range and velocity within the constraints of human muscle power. But the bow and arrow is a separate story. The spear story ends, or rather transitions, somewhere in the Upper Paleolithic, when bow technology begins appearing in the African archaeological record around 64,000 years ago and progressively through other regions in subsequent millennia. The spear didn't disappear. It remained in use in many traditions alongside and after bow adoption. But the atlatl spear system represented the apex of spear-based weaponry development, and the transition to bow and arrow reflected the same underlying design logic applied to an even more extreme range and velocity optimization. What the entire developmental trajectory from pointed stick to Levallois tipped hafted spear to atlatl launched dart demonstrates is the specific character of human technological intelligence, the capacity to identify a functional principle. Pointed objects penetrate, long reach reduces risk, greater velocity increases impact, and progressively apply that principle across multiple design iterations, each of which improves on the previous not through sudden inspiration, but through incremental empirical refinement. Return to the horse meadow from the beginning. The hominin with the spruce branch, the problem, and the intelligence to work something out. What they worked out across hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated cultural knowledge that culminated in the moment of their individual decision was not just how to throw a stick. They worked out how to concentrate force at a point, how to extend reach beyond the arm, how to use the mass and acceleration of a thrown object to deliver energy that their own muscles couldn't produce in direct contact, how to transform the properties of wood and stone through shaping into a system optimized for a specific purpose. How to pass all of that knowledge to the next generation with enough fidelity that the next generation could improve it further. The spear is sometimes described as a simple tool. It is described that way by people who haven't thought carefully about what it represents. It is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of empirical engineering, cognitive refinement, social transmission, and iterative improvement by multiple hominin species whose intelligence, whatever its specific character relative to modern humans, was clearly sufficient to produce technology that fundamentally altered the ecological position of the human lineage. The horse in the meadow was taken. The site became an archaeological deposit. 300,000 years later, someone found the evidence and started asking how it happened. The answer is more slowly, more collaboratively, and more impressively than the word invention usually implies.